So we're going to start just talking about what a statement is in JavaScript. We've already written a bunch of these, but we haven't actually talked about the individual components of our JavaScript syntax. And so we're going to kind of go back and talk about each individual part of what's happening in our syntax. So when we write JavaScript, there's many different ways that we can make a statement. A statement is basically anything that we do in our program where we're sort of expressing one sort of concrete idea. So you can think of it as like a sentence. If you're writing a paper, you might start your paper off by saying, in this paper, I'm going to explain what syntax is or something like that. And so you would make a statement, and then you would follow that with another statement. And usually there's sort of a logical sequence of statements. Programming is also a language, and so there's a very similar thing that happens where we express an idea through a statement, and then we continue making more statements. Programming gets a little bit more complicated because statements often refer to each other and do complex things. But basically, we're just kind of writing down ideas in a specific syntax. So I'm going to write out this statement in our code editor and then talk a little bit about what it means. Okay, so the first word that I'm using is var. We haven't seen this yet. Some of you guys have used it, but we haven't talked about this yet in class. var is a abbreviation for the word variable. Variable is just like a general term in computer programming that means it's something that can change. So a variable can change from one thing to another. So when we have like a number like 10, that's referred to as hard-coded. That number can never change. It's always going to represent the value 10. But we can have a variable and we can assign a number like 10 and use that, and then we can change it later. So when we say variable, that's what we mean. We can vary what that value refers to. So in this statement, I'm saying variable sentence. So this first piece of text is known as a keyword. That's why it's yellow. So as we're writing code in our P5 editor, you're going to notice that different types of text have different color highlights. Those highlights don't actually have any functional change on the code. P5, the editor, is just kind of trying to help a little bit by saying this is what type of text this is. So if you see something that's yellow, that's a JavaScript keyword. The keywords are like, there's not that many of them, and we'll use a lot of them, but they basically are words that we can't use for anything else. This second text here, sentence, is just a word that I made up. This could literally be anything I want it to be. There's a few rules about that, and we'll talk about them as we use them more. And we have actually talked a little bit about them. But this is just some text that we're assigning. We're saying this is the name of this variable that I want to use, and I can literally name that whatever I want. There are some constraints. I can't use a space. I can't use certain characters. Like I can't use like a equals sign. That's something else. So I can use like basic text. I can use numbers. I can use underscores and capital letters and stuff like that. But I can name this whatever I want. So then the next part of this statement is this equals sign. The equals sign in JavaScript means something slightly different than what it means in math. In math, equals means that both left and right side are the same thing. So if you have x equals 5 in math, that just means that x is equal to 5. In programming, the equal sign actually means that we're assigning whatever's on the right side to what's on the left side. So this is a little bit different, and that's why you'll often hear me say when I read this statement, how I would actually say this out loud is I would say variable sentence gets the string hello world. And I'm using the verb gets rather than equals because that's actually what the equals sign does in this case. It takes one value and it assigns it this name. So I'm going to say variable sentence equals, and then I'm creating a string. So a string is just a sequence of characters that's part of data rather than part of our program. And the characters I'm writing are hello world. And I'm going to put a period at the end. And then I'm going to put a semicolon at the very end of that. So we haven't really talked about semicolons. Semicolons, you might have noticed in JavaScript, are optional. So if you leave out your semicolons, 99% of the time, it's not going to change the way that your code works at all. But it's important to use semicolons because there are rare cases where it's going to break your program if you don't have the right semicolons, but it's also syntactically, it signifies this is the end of this idea. This is the end of this statement. So syntactically, for other people to read your code, because code is not something that is just run on the computer, it's something that other people read, and they have to be able to understand it. So we use syntactic conventions. We use like spelling standardization or punctuation, things like that. We use those things to make it so that other people can read our code. So this is called like a sort of like most basic, or what do they call it? MVP, minimum. No, it's not an MVP. That's a thing. But this is like our most basic program that we can write. I'm just going to log this sentence to the console. And there we go. So we've logged hello world to the console. Okay, so what we've learned here is that I can log a string to the console, no problem. I can say console.log hello world. So now you can see I've logged hello world twice. What's different here is that I've created this abstraction. I've created this idea of a variable, and the variable points to this data. But that data can change, and when we start to use this in P5, we'll see why that's really important, why that basically makes our computer do all of the crazy things that it can do. So we're starting with the bare basics, but by the end of this series of lessons, I think you'll understand the power of variables. So we can log this sentence and we can change it. We can say, actually, you know what, I want sentence to equal goodbye. And then if I log it again, we'll see that we were able to change the value that was logged by that sentence. So you can see on line 2 and line 4, those are the exact same line of code, but they're doing two different things because we changed the reference that the variable is holding. So a variable can refer to different types of data. I could also just give this a number if I wanted to, and we can actually change it from a number to a string. Okay, so let's continue.
So one doesn't cancel the first one. Like the second one didn't cancel the first one. He just added to the first one. Because usually I thought that if you write console log again,
Yeah.
the second one would show up and the first one would got canceled. Like it wouldn't show up, And
Yeah.
the hello world wouldn't show up. But it
Well,
did. So that's
Yeah, so that's an important thing to understand. Our program does what we ask it to do in the sequence that we ask it to do. So if I, let's say I didn't console.log first. So if I set the value of sentence and then I change it and then I log it, then we just see goodbye by itself. Because we've made the sentence variable, we changed the value of that sentence variable, and then we logged it. So we just see that. But in the first version of this program, I set the value, I logged it, then I changed it, then I logged it again. So the order that we do the operations in is important.
So the order of the log.
Yeah, exactly, from top to bottom. That's not always true. Sometimes something that happens that looks like it's up here can happen down here, or things can move around. But at this point, it's going to go just in order. And we'll talk about that more. We'll see more examples of that. Any other questions? Okay, I know this is very, very basic and not interesting, but we need to understand how these basics work to be able to use them to do more interesting things. So a couple things to notice about JavaScript. So JavaScript doesn't care about the amount of white space or empty space in your program. So for example, if I go like this, it's going to totally ignore all that space, okay? It acts exactly the same. So the program basically just ignores these extra spaces. We do need some spaces. So a space between variable and sentence is important because it separates those two terms. So if I don't have a space there and I try to run that, I get this error because it's like this thing doesn't exist. Like I don't get this. So we use a space there to say we've finished this word and we're moving to the next word. But if we have 10 spaces there, it doesn't make a difference. It just reads that as one space. Obviously, in our text, if I have a bunch of spaces, that's part of that text. So our data works a little bit differently than the code, the syntax in the code. One thing that you'll see is that there's also conventions around how much space that we add before different lines of code. So when we've been writing our P5 sketches, we move some of our code over when it's inside of a code block. So JavaScript doesn't really care. The computer doesn't really care where we put things. It reads it the same way, but it makes it easier for us to read and understand. So for example, I don't have to put a space here. That'll work the same way. But I do put a space here because it's easier to read. I can see a space between each important part of my program. Same thing over here. Oh no, this one will probably give me an error. Oh no, that one works. So I don't need a space after the variable, but I add a space there because it makes it easier to read. So sometimes syntax choices are because it'll break the program. Sometimes it's just because it's easier to understand what it's saying. So another thing to point out is that this word, it really doesn't matter. I can call this whatever I want. It's just, as long as it's unique, the computer will be able to remember it. Okay. So when I say variable banana, all I'm really doing is making like a keyword. So we use keywords for things all the time. You say, the name of the street, the zip code. There's all these different things that we assign to refer to ideas. We know when we say a zip code that doesn't literally mean the physical space. It's a reference that people understand to refer to an area in geography. It's the same thing on the computer, except we're talking about the memory of the computer. When we say variable banana, what the computer is doing is it's finding like a little bit of memory that's available on the hard drive, and it's saying, okay, we're going to call this thing banana because that's what our programmer wants to call it. And if they ask for banana again, we're going to come back here and see what they put here, and we're going to bring that back. So the name of this doesn't matter as long as I don't like have weird things like I can't put a dash right there. I can't put a space right there. I can't put like a asterisk right there. Anything that's used by the program to do other stuff, or if I try to put like a plus sign here, that cannot be part of my variable name. Yeah.
In what scenario will you actually use that?
A variable?
Yeah.
We'll be using them a little bit later, and I'll show you why they're useful.
1 sec.
Okay. No worries. Okay. So let's keep going. So we already talked about the assignment operator, talking about variables. So a variable technically has two parts. So we can actually create a variable. We can say variable, let's just call it A. This is a useful or a legitimate statement. It's not going to have anything. So if I try to console.log A, it says undefined. So when I make a variable in JavaScript and I don't give it a value, it exists, but it's undefined. This is different than if I just tried to reference A. If I just try to reference A, it's a red error. But if I declare A, so this is called declaring. Declaring is basically like just saying this thing exists. I want a thing called A, find some memory for it. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm going to put something there eventually. So I can declare a variable, and then I can assign a variable later. So I can say A equals banana. That's probably confusing. Let's call it sandwich. Okay, so now if I console.log A again, now I have a value there, sandwich. Okay, so this is called assignment. A lot of the time when we make variables, we declare and assign at the same time. So in this example up here, our first example, we're both declaring banana and we're assigning banana in one statement. So sometimes our statements can do multiple things. In this statement, we're just saying A exists, and this is actually going to be useful in the future. We're going to need to use this later in class. And when we first declare that it exists, it doesn't have a value, so we get undefined. Sometimes when you're debugging, you'll see undefined, and that's what that means. It means the variable exists, but you haven't given it a number or a string, some value. Assignment means that we assign the variable. And you'll notice in this statement, I didn't use var, because A already exists. So the first time I say variable A, now A exists for the rest of the program. I don't need to use var again if I want to reassign A or do something with A. I don't have to use var when I console.log A. If I want to, add A to something later, I don't have to redeclare it. Once I declare it once, it exists, and I can change the value and do other stuff with it, but I don't have to declare it again. Okay, so when we declare and assign, that's called initializing. These are just big words. It seems maybe silly, but so if I say variable b equals hot dog, that is initializing. You might think, why do we need these big words? But when we're talking about code, it's good to have words that are specific, that mean different things. So if I tell a programmer, you forgot to assign the variable versus you forgot to initialize the variable, those mean two different things. So by using this kind of specific language, it's easier to communicate about how our code works. Okay. So in JavaScript, we have numbers and strings. Numbers are just number values. We can just write them. We don't need to do anything else. So if I want a number, I can say variable n equals 10. And JavaScript will say OK. So now I can say console.log n. And so now I have this number. And I can do stuff with this. So if I could say, what if I wanted to know what n plus n was? It'll tell me, well, n plus n is 20. Okay, so I can do math. I can say console.log what's n times n, and it'll multiply that for me. So once I have n, I can use n as many times as I want, and it'll just refer to that value that I put there, unless I change it, of course. But so far I haven't changed it. Okay, so I can use numbers. Sometimes numbers have decimal points. So if I said 10.5, then these values will change. But that's pretty much works the way you would expect in math. But we can also have strings. And so strings are a type of data that just represents text. And you can put anything that you want in there. The program doesn't really care if it's spelled right or capitalized or anything like that. If you say, this is the text I want, the computer just remembers that text, and then you can just use it later. So if we have variable s equals string, and we say, or that's going to be confusing. Let's say s equals, what did I say here? 10. Okay, so that looks like the idea of 10, but it's not 10, right? I can't do s times s. Okay, that gives me nan. Nan means not a number. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we're debugging. But it's saying like, okay, I know you think that's 10, but that's not 10. That's just TEN. Those are just the characters TEN. So we have number type data, which we can do mathematical operations with, and then we have string type data, which we can't. And if we're not sure, we can always check. So we can say console.log type of s, and it'll tell me that type is a string. We don't really do that a lot, but just you can do it if you want. Okay, let's keep going. This isn't really that important. We can add strings together, so you can do, I could say this, actually this will work, if I say console.log s plus s. That'll actually work because it'll just put those two strings next to each other. This is actually called concatenation, not addition. Addition is when you add numbers. Concatenation is when you add strings. We don't really need to use that right now, but just so you know that. Okay, we already talked about that. So these are our operators. We talked about the equal sign, which is assignment. So you assign a value to a variable. You also have the 4 basic arithmetic operators, so plus, minus, divide, multiply. So you can do all that stuff. That's concatenation. We talked about that. This we're not going to worry about for right now. And yeah, we'll talk about that later. Okay, so those are our basics. So I'll save this as syntax basics. Okay. So now we're going to talk about how to actually use variables. I'm going to